Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Ivy Vo. I graduated from Tufts in 2009. I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Committee on the Alumni Council. I'm also the chair of the Tufts Alumni Paris chapter. And I'm really pleased, I'm currently in Paris. I'm really pleased to welcome you today. This is part of the Global Tufts Month series, which is a university-wide initiative that started in 2019, and now it's evolved into an annual event. And basically, it's a month-long series of activities and events designed to, amongst other things, celebrate and advance Tufts' commitment to global engagement, international exchange, and global learning. This year's theme, the big one, is welcoming all voices, global perspectives on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. So there are about 8 days left of events. So the event of this Global Tufts Month ends March 31st. So I encourage you afterwards to go check our calendar and to sign up for as many events as you can for the rest of the event. This event is being organized and sponsored by Tufts Alumni Central Europe. On that note, I would love to introduce our moderator for this evening, Drew Burt, who is a Tufts alumna from 1983. Drew is currently based in Rome. She has had over 30 years of professional experience in Rome, Italy, almost exclusively with higher education programs. Since October 2017, she has been the Associate Dean of Academic Administration at the American University of Rome. Prior to this date, she was the Director and Assistant Dean of the Peter J. Tobin College of Business MBA program at St. John's University Rome campus, and the Associate Director of their undergraduate study abroad programs. She's basically my neighbor right now, but she's a little bit far. We're so close, but so far away from each other right now. So Drew, I'll hand over the virtual mic to you, and I'll let you take over the moderation.
And we're also in mini lockdowns, so we couldn't see each other even if we wanted to, especially without a police document. Okay, so just a quick introduction. Thank you for joining us today or this evening, depending upon where you are. I'm happy to see that some of our many friends who signed up from our year did show up. Other ones haven't yet, but they'll probably come on. Some months ago, I proposed Lisa's Guantanamo lecture to the Tufts Alumni Central European chapter because she graciously presented a similar but different event at AUR, the American University of Rome, when she passed through Rome on one of her many visits to my home. I've been very lucky to have Lisa in my home many times. Lisa is a professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She has held a visiting appointment at the Edward Said Chair of American Studies at the American University of Beirut and served as the interim director of the Center for American Studies and Research, also at AUB. Earlier in her career, she taught at Morehouse College and Swarthmore College. Lisa's work focuses mainly on issues relating to law and conflict, military courts and occupations, human rights and international law, and torture and targeted killing. She has written many publications and contributes to important trade journals and magazines. She's currently finishing a book titled The War in Court, The Inside Story of the Fight Against Torture in the War on Terror, did I say that right? Which will be published by University of California Press. Lisa has an MA in Arab Studies with a concentration in International Affairs from Georgetown University and a PhD in Sociology from the American University. And as you are aware, she has a BA from Tufts University. And that is where we met our sophomore years. We both moved into an off-campus house with 30 students. Some of them are here. Many are here today. I mentioned this important point as our deep friendship started long ago as undergraduate students at Tufts. Since 2010, Lisa has traveled to Guantanamo 13 times. Today, you have the special opportunity to hear her firsthand account of what it's like to go to Guantanamo Bay, where she has toured the prison and has observed numerous hearings of the military commissions. So Lisa will give a talk that's about 30 minutes long, and then she'll give 20 minutes of interactive questions. So I give the floor to Lisa. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Drew. Thank you, Ivy and Jabra, and everybody, especially the friends who have taken time out to participate today. It's lovely to see you all. Miss my Tufts friends. So what I'm going to talk about today just is a real overview of what's been and continues to be going on at Guantanamo. I mean, one of the things that, oftentimes strikes me when I'm about to go to Guantanamo, and I'll tell friends or colleagues, I'm heading off to Guantanamo, Guantanamo. And even, highly astute, politically aware people will say like, oh, I forgot that place was open, or, oh, what's happening down there? And so, in some sense, this is, an opportunity to, sort of convey what is going on. And, of course, because of COVID, very little is going on now. Everything's kind of frozen. But one thing, when I first started working on, really right after 9/11, because I had already been working on torture in the 90s, like I was doing torture before it was cool. But immediately after 9/11, in the days afterwards, when I started listening to things that former Vice President Dick Cheney was saying about how the United States was going to respond to the horrific terrorist attacks of September 11th, I immediately could sense that the United States was going to choose to go down the torture trail. And that's exactly what happened. And so Guantanamo was selected by the Bush administration as the facility for long-term interrogation and detention of people who were captured in the war on terror. And the reason Guantanamo was selected was because certain lawyers in the Bush administration came up with the idea that Guantanamo was beyond the reach of US laws. And so the Bush administration wanted to use torture, didn't want to allow these people who were detained by the United States to have access to lawyers or courts. And that was really the reason why Guantanamo was selected. But what happened, and this is really the subject of the book that I'm working on, was that lawyers started fighting the government. First, it was just a couple of lawyers, but they, took the government to court over and over again. And so, in some ways, the meaning of Guantanamo has been transformed because in a few important cases, lawyers fought the government and won. But anyway, so I was, from the early on in the war on terror, I started, doing research on these lawyers, and as the fact that the US government had authorized a torture policy, started doing this kind of work. But for years, my research, and I didn't know how the research would end, but I thought to myself, I can't go to Guantanamo. Like I can only do research by talking to people, in their offices or on Skype. And then one day in 2010, this is already when President Obama inherited the Guantanamo detention facility. I was meeting a psychologist friend who was an expert witness for one case. It was the first case of a Guantanamo detainee that putatively liberal President Barack Obama decided to prosecute. And the detainee's name was Omar Khadr, who was a Canadian citizen who was brought to Guantanamo in October of 2002 when he was 16 years old. And he was the first person that the Obama administration wanted to prosecute. And did prosecute, in fact. And it's the first time a child soldier was prosecuted for war crimes since World War II. So it's a very ignominious legacy that Obama has left, following on Bush's legacy. But anyway, so I'm in New York City with this psychologist friend of mine. She's an expert witness, and she was talking about going down to Guantanamo to testify in that particular military commission hearing. And, I was like, over and over, I've heard people talking about it, and what was going to be happening that spring and summer of 2010 was that the torture that this child soldier, Omar Khadr, had been subjected to was going to be litigated over whether or not any statements he made to US interrogators could be used in court. And it's was so in my wheelhouse. And I was so jealous I couldn't go. And so in that New York City diner, she was saying, oh, I wish you could go and be there, friendly face in the crowd. And I was like, oh God, I wish I could be there too. And then she said something, she said, well, you could go if you go as a journalist. And it was like, ding, 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 ding. I write journalistically, but and the one thing I will give the Pentagon credit, I then applied as a journalist, to go down to Guantanamo, and they let me. So I would say kudos to the Pentagon. And so that was basically how I've been to Guantanamo a number of times. So I just want to, I'm not going to do what academics do, which is, complicated PowerPoints, but I just want to share my screen for a few moments just to show you some images, and then I'll come back and then I'll talk about what these images mean. Okay, so let me put this on. Beginning. Okay, so this is, I mean, the military doesn't have much of a sense of irony, so like they unironically call, this place Camp Justice, but these tents are where the journalists sleep. So that's our sort of housing our housing location. This is some of the basic facts about Guantanamo today. So the total number of detainees ever held there from the beginning was 779. And today there are 40 detainees left. The cost per detainee per year is $13 million. Of those 45 have been cleared for release for years. They were even cleared for release during the Obama administration, but weren't released. And then during the Trump administration, only one person was released. And so these 5 have been waiting for, more than, they've been there since 2002. There are 26 prisoners who are categorized as forever prisoners, which means that the government has no evidence to prosecute them, but regards them as too dangerous to be released. So they've basically been held without charges or trial for, what's now going on 20 years. 3 have already been convicted and are serving their sentences, convicted in the military commissions or waiting their sentencing. And 6 are facing trial by military commission. And I'm going to end the talk about those because there's 2 main cases in the military commissions. One is the 9/11 case. 5 people are accused of varying roles in the 9/11 terrorist attacks. All 5 of them were brutally tortured by the CIA, and that's basically the reason why the trial is being stalled. And the other one, the 6th person is accused of being responsibility for the bombing of the USS Cole in the year 2000 off the coast of Yemen. Okay, just a couple more pictures, and then I'll bring it back to all of our faces. So this is, journalists really are, and I really came to appreciate this once I started going to Guantanamo. Like, journalists are the only way that anything about Guantanamo, or the main way that anything about Guantanamo can be known. Like those people who go down to Guantanamo and can see and observe certain kinds of things, really bring that sort of message back. So in earlier years, I had done a few prison tours. And so the kind of facility for the compliant prisoners, or for the ones, for example, who've been cleared for release, they are allowed to cook and, have, television watching in communal areas. But the 14 who were at Guantanamo, including those prosecuted for 9/11, and the USS Cole bombing, who were in CIA custody, are held in a highly secretive facility on Guantanamo called Camp 7. And the reason this facility is so highly secretive is because although the CIA torture program is over, it's still considered one of the most highly classified government secrets. And so specifically, what is secret is the memories that these detainees have about what the CIA did to them. So they are held in a very secretive facility. They have no access except when they're brought to court, for those who are brought to court. The old military commission building was actually once a dental facility on Guantanamo. But part of the reason that I'm showing you these images is that although journalists are there and they can see the full, 180 degrees, you can see everything, but every image that comes out of Guantanamo is censored by the military. So you're not allowed to depict certain things. So this is, like, for example, all one can depict of the high security military commission building, like that you can't show anything beyond these light poles for whatever, on the understanding that, so national security would be compromised. And then this is inside, inside the military commission building for the 9/11 case. There's 5 defendants and their rows of lawyers, at each table. And then journalists and NGO observers and family members of the victims of 9/11 who go to Guantanamo sit in a gallery, in the behind the courtroom. And let me see what else I got here. So, all right, that's it. I will stop sharing. So, okay. So hi. So when the case is the issue for journalists going down there is, one of the things that I realized and I learned, was that when you, there's an article, I think that either Ivy or Jabari will post some links to my things. But one thing I learned going down as a journalist was that because Guantanamo was such a closed and difficult and inaccessible place to go, one of the services that journalists can provide is by live tweeting what's going on in the military commissions. And so, it's one of those things where I actually learned how to tweet, as a result of that and doing this. But so I'm going to basically just say a few things about the military, the detention and then military commissions, and then I'll open it up for question. So just to provide some context, there was, the Bush administration had decided, certain officials in the Bush administration convinced themselves out of abject ignorance that violent and coercive interrogation tactics would actually be useful for getting true and accurate information out of detainees. And so the Bush administration authorized a policy of torture, and government lawyers reinterpreted the law to legalize torture. And so then it was, through a number of court battles where lawyers fought the government and sort of rolled things back in that regard. But one thing we can say without, anybody who's at least capable of, thinking in realistic ways, is that the use of torture on detainees was an abject failure. It did not produce accurate intelligence. It compromised U.S. national security. It made Guantanamo a blight on the nation and the world. And it's one that's, in the sense, because it's still open, that blight is an enduring one. But if you even just think about it, I'm going to, maybe hone in for the last bit on the 9/11, the 5 detainees who are accused of responsibility for 9/11. So this includes the person who has, claimed to be the so-called mastermind of 9/11, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And 4 other people who are accused of either recruiting the hijackers or providing money, sort of funding the hijackers who perpetrated the attack on 9/11. All of them spent years in CIA custody, being brutally tortured. So for example, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, among the things that were done to him was he was waterboarded, which means being essentially tied to a board with your head lower than your feet, cloth put over the face, water poured on it. He was, so that you actually feel that you're drowning. He was waterboarded 183 times. But one of the things that we learned in these, hearings, so the military commission case against the 9/11, it's been going on since the Bush administration, and the idea would be, could you bring justice to the victims, the 2,973 people who were killed on 9/11? If this prosecution is the way of bringing justice, there is no justice. So one of the issues that came up in the years of the 9/11 case, and essentially the case isn't even going on yet. They're still in the pretrial phase where the teams of defense lawyers are fighting the government for access to information about what the CIA did to the people who are now on trial and facing the death penalty. So that's sort of the tension. So Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for example, not only was he waterboarded 183 times, but the technique that the interrogators who ran the CIA torture program found most effective for him was a technique called walling, where somebody's had a foam collar put around their head, attached to a chain, and then they're thrown into a wall and yanked back over and over again. And so Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, was walled innumerable times. And in 2018, when his lawyers finally were able to persuade the military to allow MRIs, brain scans on the detainees, they found that, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has, traumatic brain injury as a result of what happened to him in the black sites. That's one of those, what many lawyers would say is that the government that tortured Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has lost the right to execute Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. But the government refuses to consider plea bargaining. And so this case just drags on and on and on in terms of like what will be permitted. Another one of the detainees, the 9/11 one thing is, one of them has literally been driven mad, through his experience in the CIA torture black sites. His name is Ramzi bin Oshibeh, and but he doesn't recognize his madness. And so the madness, he believes that he's constantly subjected to noise and vibrations, and even that, mental situation has stalled the case on its own. Another one of the 5 is named Mustafa Hossawi, who was so brutally sodomized by the CIA that he had to have rectal reconstructive surgery in Guantanamo, and his lawyers, and he still suffers badly, and his lawyers think that he won't last much longer. But so, the point, just to take away from this is that there would be, how would we think about, dealing with this, ongoing, unresolved, unjust debacle that is Guantanamo? Many people have said that it's possible to close Guantanamo, to relocate people, to release the people who can't be charged or tried to their home countries or whatever. But, it's the problem of Guantanamo is one of the few political problems that is bipartisan. Both Republicans and Democrats have, for domestic political reasons, such strong opposition to taking a bold move, because nobody wants to be, chastised on Fox News or wherever as being soft on terrorism. So in order to even do anything about Guantanamo, Congress would actually have to eliminate legislation that was passed that blocks detainees from being brought to the United States for any reason, including trial. And there would have to just be other ways of thinking about this issue. But I want to maybe end on a slightly more, upbeat role. There's been a lot of, I would say that the awareness of people, who come to recognize what the fact that the US government engaged in torture has done, how damaging it has been for national security, for the United States' reputation in the world, for the pursuit of legal justice for those who are accused of responsibility for the single greatest crime against humanity in recent decades. All of these things have created new communities of concern and activism and so on. So one, I would just even do a plug for the new film that was recently released called The Mauritanian. And so in that film, it was directed by Kevin McDonald, starring Jodie Foster as one of the lawyers who I write about. But the main story is about a man named Mohamedou Slahi, who's a Mauritanian. And just to give a little bit of a context, when he was brought to Guantanamo, the CIA got him first, but when he was brought to Guantanamo, the US government mistakenly assumed that he was involved in 9/11. He was one of the plotters of 9/11. And so under Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's orders, Salahi was one of the 2 Guantanamo detainees subjected to the most brutal interrogation techniques, the usual standard nakedness, religious humiliation, sexual, humiliation, sleep deprivation. That's the normal standard operating torture. But Salahi was also subjected to mock execution when they took him out in a boat off the coast of Cuba and threatened to drown him. That almost broke him, but what really broke Salahi was the fact that they created this huge ruse that his beloved mother had been taken into custody, and they were about to bring her to Guantanamo and dump her into the prison with all the male detainees. And so, although Salahi wasn't guilty of any of the things he was accused of, he started confessing, because that was the only, in a sense, it was false tortured confessions. So his lawyer, Nancy Hollander, who's played by Jodie Foster, fights the government, and so that's sort of, in a sense, the film is one of redemption. But even after Salahi was cleared for release, the Obama administration held him for an additional 6 years. So it was only in 2016 that he was able to get out. But Salahi now, he's a wonderful guy. We've become friends, and I'm doing 2 events with him at UCSB in May. So one of them is that Salahi and I are going to have a conversation about his role in the making of the film, The Mauritanian. That's on May 25th. And then he's going to be giving a public talk at a conference I'm organizing, just talking about how he survived the prison. And one of the ways he survived the prison, and one of the ways that many of at least the sort of dispositionally stronger prisoners did survive that experience, was either through art, through writing, in a sense. So there have been some very powerful ways of communicating the experiences of Guantanamo to other people. I want to actually open it up, though, to question and answer, so that in case, and I'm happy to elaborate on anything or talk about other things, but just in case, because I don't really know what people find curious or would like to know about. So I think Drew's going to moderate the Q&A. So I don't know how you're doing that, Drew.
We can either have people raise their hands with the little hand signal,
I
or
see.
just
There's Vicky Gard has, how can we bring Guantanamo to an end? I mean, okay. I would say that this is really, that's an excellent question. And it's one that has, stymied people for, who have been trying to get it closed for years. But this is really a domestic political issue, because Congress, one administration after another created and maintained Guantanamo, and Congress, passed legislation making it very difficult to close Guantanamo. So one of the things that's just so revealing about US domestic politics is the one thing that actually moves people to think like maybe we should close this place is the simple fact that it costs $13 million per year per detainee. So even if people are not moved by the humanistic or the legal issues, so the budget saving types might be interested. But I would say that, to find more information about those who are seeking to close Guantanamo, there's an organization of activists and lawyers called Close Guantanamo. In the New York Review of Books several weeks ago, seven former detainees published an open letter to President Biden, which includes like an 8-point plan about how his administration could go about closing Guantanamo. I see Parmley has his hand up. Parmley, did you want to ask your question with your mic?
I did. First of all, thanks much for your talk, and thanks to Tufts for organizing this event. As I mentioned earlier, I published an article about 9 years ago in which I proposed a way to close Guantanamo. And it was a special time because you had Obama as the American president and you had Raul as the Cuban president. And that was the perfect time to do it. Now, as you say, US politics has sort of taken over the whole thing. I was wondering though, Lisa, thanks for your talk. what is the current status? In other words, has anyone in the Biden administration given any thought to Guantanamo that you know of?
I mean, to my knowledge is that they are going to be, sort of dealing with Guantanamo in some way or another. The same, but it's not, given the pandemic, given, sort of, racism, insurrection, et cetera. I don't think it's a top priority. But I think, one of the senses that I get was that, what Obama, and this is, my take on these things, Obama probably sincerely wanted to close Guantanamo. I mean, he, on his second day in office, he signed 3 executive orders, one of which was a pledge to close Guantanamo within 1 year. But then—
Lisa, that's absolutely correct. And a close advisor to Obama told me as Obama was leaving, Michael, don't ever give up on closing Guantanamo.
Right. Well, I think in my opinion, Obama's original sin was appointing Rahm Emanuel as his chief of staff, because Rahm Emanuel had no interest in bad publicity on Fox. Rahm Emanuel felt that anything the Obama administration does should be approved by Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham loved Guantanamo, hated rights for detainees, loved the military commissions. And so in a sense, Obama, through his limpid, aspirations for bipartisanship, just, failed completely. When Trump ran for office in 2016, one of his campaign slogans was to bring back the water board, bring back that form of torture that Obama had at least canceled the torture program. And Trump won the election. So it's part of this legacy that we have, that where there are now, despite the fact that torture doesn't work, that Guantanamo has been an aberration, that our country, national security has been badly damaged, a demographic majority of Americans today would support the use of torture sometimes or often if politicians tell them it would help keep them safe. So we have an unresolved political problem in this country. Does anybody else have a question?
Bruce Wilder wrote a question. I don't know if Bruce Wilder is still here and wants to ask it.
Wait, let me see.
Okay.
I'm just going to see what's in the chat.
And Vicky asked the question too.
Yeah, there's another question from Vicky Garth. I was saying, has the CIA, so here's a question from Vicky Garth. Has the CIA learned anything from the Guantanamo experience? Has any policy changed? Would they take a different approach in a similar situation in the future? I actually think that the CIA has learned a lesson because, in 2009, when what started as a bipartisan effort, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence did, it was like a month after Obama completely took the CIA out of the interrogation business with one of his first executive orders. And then the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence undertook what turned into a multi-year study of the CIA's torture program. And the conclusion that study, the SSCI report, was that it was worse. The CIA torture was worse than the CIA had told their overseers in Congress. It was completely ineffective, and it did incredible damage to national security. So there's another movie about that particular thing. It's called The Report, that came out last year. And so when Trump wanted to bring back the water board, people in the CIA were like, forget about it. So I think that the CIA would not go down that path again.
That's correct.
I think there's Patricia Artigas has a question. Do you want to ask it in your voice or?
Yes. And well, thank you for doing this. It's very interesting. I am involved with human rights, and I was wondering, why now they, has been able to close Guantanamo so far. So the question is, why you mentioned that there are 6 prisoners that are, clear to be released, but have not been released. Why is that?
Okay, so when I have to provide a little bit of context. So during the Obama years, because Obama was trying, despite Rahm Emanuel, et cetera, to release prisoners who'd been cleared, who were deemed to be no longer suspicious, even though, actually, let me just make one little factoid mention that is useful. Of the 779 prisoners who ever went to Guantanamo, 5% were captured by the United States, by US forces. 95% were sold to the United States for bounty by Afghan warlords or the Pakistan intelligence agencies. So there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who had no, responsibility for even involved in terrorism. So, in fact, the Bush administration had released 532 by the time he left office. And so the Obama administration was trying to at least release ones who could. But then in December, on Christmas Day of 2009, there was an attempt by a Nigerian man to detonate a bomb that was in his underwear when he was on a plane, flying toward, transatlantic flight to Detroit. And then, he was stopped, the plane didn't blow up, and then he was questioned by the FBI, and one thing that came out was that he was influenced in this particular terrorist act by Al-Qaeda influencers in Yemen, including a US citizen named Anwar al-Awlaki, who happened to be one of the people that then the Obama administration targeted, extrajudicially executed with a drone. But so Obama froze all release of Yemeni detainees. And at that time, there were 86 who were cleared for release. We didn't want to send people back to Yemen, at that time. And so some of those 6 who are still there, I believe, are Yemenis. And it's because of the political situation in Yemen that the government is reluctant to send them back. So they're trapped in this, sense. But there are other of the other people who are like the forever prisoners. The first prisoner that the CIA took into custody was a man whose nom de guerre is Abu Zubaydah, and he was the guinea pig for the torture program. I mean, they literally experimented on him for using all the techniques. When he was originally captured, the Bush administration claimed that they had Al-Qaeda's third in command. And so then they were using all this torture on him on the assumption that he had all this juicy information and only torture would work. Well, years later, it's amazing, like he wasn't even a member of Al-Qaeda. But because he was so brutally tortured, they can never, by the CIA, and the torture by the CIA remains a classified secret, they can never release him and they can never try him, right? So he's one of the, the cases of people who are just, stuck in this bizarre limbo. Wait, I see, Drew, do you see any other questions? I see Bruce Wilder has a question. How can we?
So does Mitch.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead, Mitch. Mitch, you're muted.
Oh, yeah. So Steve already answered my question. I was wondering if you were at Guantanamo right now because you got the barbed wire behind you.
No, I have a green screen. But this is like, sort of a classic Guantanamo, like no photography signs in places.
No, a different question, if you don't mind. So you say it's $13 million per prisoner. Is that mostly, built-in costs, or if they added one more prisoner, would they actually cost a full $13 million more?
I think it's like, I think that figure is calibrated by the journalist Carol Rosenberg, who has been to Guantanamo. Carol is a good friend of mine now. She has been to Guantanamo like 1,000 times. And so she is the most dogged journalist on this story. And so she's put that together. It would include the cost of the guard forces, basically the maintenance of the prison and the guarding of prisoners, travel, the cost of funding the lawyers to go down whenever there's hearings and things. So it would be basically, taking the number of prisoners divided by the total expenses of the prison and the military commissions, like leaving, it doesn't include like what it takes to run just the regular part of the Navy base. But so that's the 13 million per prisoner, per detainee, per year. Anybody else have a question?
Are you planning on going back soon?
Well, it's like, this is one of those weird things where, when I work on, because I work on torture. And so I love going to Guantanamo. It's so bizarre, but it's like, it's something that really draws me. And so I'm always like, when I can go to Guantanamo, I'm very excited. It's like, yeah, I'm going to Guantanamo again. I mean, partially because, I'm friends with the few journalists who really keep on slogging it off down there. Because the reason it's very few journalists go these days is because really what's going on are these military commission cases, particularly the 9/11 case. And it is just, it's not, flashy headline news. So a lot of media outlets won't send anybody. But it is the, Carol Rosenberg, who now used to write for the Miami Herald, now writes for the New York Times, and a few other people go down there regularly, but it doesn't get covered as nearly as much as it should. And so that's why I'm thinking, that the film, The Mauritanian, will refocus people's attention on it.
Howie wrote a good question or comment in the chat.
Oh, wait, where is it? Howie, you want to say it out loud?
Sure.
Okay.
I'm usually in the back row and don't say anything, but I'm just thinking, like, what's the end game? It seems to me like no politician wants to take the risk in case somebody actually does something and commits a crime, and then they're the ones that let them out. So are they just, what's your prediction? Are people just politicians gonna wait until everybody there gets old and dies?
I mean, I think it's like, it's the de facto answer. I think that actually is it, even though there have been a few people who were released and sort of then went back to the fight. But one could say, they might not have been actually engaged in terrorist activities prior to being sold for bounty. And, it might have been their experiences that, turned them into, active hostilities. But it is, in a sense, I don't have the answer to, the question of like, what can actually happen, but it's, I think Howie kind of nails it on the head. Like, the inaction will just mean that people will just stay there. This farce of military commissions will keep on going until everybody just dies off. One of the people who was convicted and given a life sentence, his name is Ali al-Bahlul. He was he was never actually accused of any kind of acts of violence, but he was a propagandist for Al-Qaeda. And so he basically regarded his detention as his own personal jihad. He didn't, put up any kind of a fight when his military commission case, he basically boycotted his own trial. And then the military jury, when it was the sentencing phase, he taunted them by saying, I wanted to be one of the 9/11 hijackers, but I couldn't get a visa. And so then they gave him life in prison. So he's, and he's in fairly good shape health-wise. He's in his early 40s. So, he could live another 40 years. You could see if, like, without any political solution, like Guantanamo could at least be open until, Ali al-Bahlul dies, unless there's some kind of a, a change in politics. There's another question from Vicky Garth. Oh, no, actually, no COVID down there. They didn't have any COVID outbreaks at the base. They were extremely careful. But, what I've been following is that now I think everybody on the base has received at least one shot. But Republican Congress people were opposed to vaccinating the prisoners, which is, on the grounds that, like, well, why should terrorists get, vaccines when, good Americans aren't getting them? But, it sort of misunderstands the fact that when someone is in custody, that in any kind of situation, that person is unfree, and the custodian bears responsibility for that person. So it was like another, flap over partisan, nonsense. But I do believe that, there's been no big COVID outbreaks down there. And, I'm pretty sure everybody's on their way to getting vaccinated now. Vicky has asked whether Biden's goals, what are Biden's goals? I don't, know what Biden's goals are, but I guess we will find out what they are imminently. But I don't think that Biden is as, timid about being lambasted on Fox News as Obama was. So, we're just leaving aside Guantanamo. Guantanamo is more like a symbol of our, very problematic domestic politics rather than, it reflects our politics, right? I think that there's so many issues that, Americans have to deal with about what is justice, what is the rule of law, what should happen when people violate the rule of law, what should happen when people violate the law when they are government officials. Nobody has ever been held accountable for torture. So we have a very deeply and complexly problematic domestic political scene. Let's see. How do the remaining prisoners mentally deal with this horrible travesty of life? So, there's a lot of, not only is there a lot of mental illness among some of the prisoners, but there's also been, again, sort of coming back to Mitch's point, there's been this, both a political and a financial resistance to even providing these torture victims who are, in our custody with any kind of psychological therapy or maintenance. And so, to some extent, the prisoners, are able to, in the different, whether they're the compliant prisoners or those in the top secret Camp 7, they can interact somewhat with each other. But it is, this whole thing is one big example of human experimentation. And after the Nazi Holocaust, we would have thought that experimenting on human beings, for these malign purposes would never happen again, like the never again thing. And yet, it was the Cheneys and the, director of the CIA and certain right-wing lawyers who basically decided to re-embark on a process of human experimentation. And we are living, the human beings who were the experimented upon ones are still in our custody. And so it's, it's worse than you think. That was why I called the talk that. Any other questions? Well, I would say in terms of this, maybe like to lighten it up, if anybody wants to go to Guantanamo, if you can pose as a journalist, the bar is quite low for being allowed to go there, and it is something something to be seen. Like I oftentimes when I give public talks, I even for example, if you got permission from your local newspaper and said you want to go to Guantanamo reporting for the Sacramento Bee or something, you might be able to get down there once once the COVID stuff ends. Vicky Garth asked another question about the watercolors. There was one of the 9/11, one of the 5 defendants in 9/11 is named Amar al-Baluchi. And, and he suffers all kinds of mental repercussions from his torture. And he, but he was using, painting as a form of mental therapy. And so he painted these paintings, and then his lawyers got permission to actually take the paintings out of Guantanamo, and they were on display at various sort of university museums, I think. But then when the Trump administration came in, they stopped it. They basically said that the US government owns his art. Like anything that is produced at Guantanamo is US government property. So yeah, but his art is art. So I don't know if I'm assuming that Jabari posted some of the links to my article. So one of the articles called "Torture is the Nasty Center of the 9/11 Trial" goes into rather great detail about the issues in the 9/11 case specifically, and talking about this guy who did the watercolors, Amar al-Baluchi. If any of you saw the very not good, sort of CIA hagiography, Zero Dark 30, it is nevertheless quite accurate on the torture, the film Zero Dark 30, because the CIA gave filmmakers access to information that even the 9/11 lawyers, defense lawyers don't have. And so the opening scenes of torture in Zero Dark 30 are actually based on this guy, Amar al-Baluchi, who's one of the 9/11 5. So, oh, I see Bruce Wilder has posted a reference to something. Anyone else have any? I know this is a very uncheerful talk, but it's sort of, I always say that for whatever bizarre personal dispositional reason, like I find I get the most energy and commitment about things that make me angry. So like I love to study things I hate. You know, that's my that sort of kept me youthful. Drew, you want to? I see you giggling.
No, I think if there aren't any other questions, Ivy, are you still around? We could.
I'm still around. Yeah, I'm still around. Lisa,
okay.
do you want to add any other anecdotes? Well, we have about 8 minutes left. Or anything else?
Okay.
And this is so fascinating. You're the expert, so I think we're all just soaking. I'm at least soaking it all in right now.
Yeah, well, I'll just say, just to maybe then like talk about what it's like actually being at Guantanamo. I mean, in the as a journalist, in not as a prisoner, in the during the Obama years when it was the trial of Omar Khadr, because he was a Canadian, because he was a child soldier, like there were like huge numbers of journalists that would go down at that time to cover the case. Nowadays, it's like you're lucky if you have 6 journalists. But back in the olden days, we would, I mean, and this sort of is true even now when the number of journalists is much smaller, every night, I mean, it's beautiful under the starry skies. There's no, there's no lights because you're on a Navy base. And so we would sit around with our liter-sized bottles of Jameson into the wee hours, like debating the finer points of US foreign policy and national security. And so, many, occasions of that kind of, like incomparable experience to be someplace that, is so important and yet so underknown, and with people who know so much about something that so many people know so very little about. And so it's just an incredible experience of being able to, like, it's like your people or the people who can really like have, an hours of conversations about the torture memos or, the suppression of evidence and so on. So yeah, I'm trying to capture that in the book that I'm writing and hopefully will finish in the next couple of months, which is really the legal fight. It's like the law, because really the only people who fought against torture were lawyers. There was no mass, social movement that emerged or anything. And so this really has been a fight waged by lawyers on the legal terrain against other lawyers who are, representing the government.
How free are you to move around when you're there, or how do you actually get there? Do you go with the Pentagon, or do you fly, commercial, or how do you go?
Well, actually, the Pentagon in recent years, like the Pentagon basically charters a commercial plane, and then on the plane, everybody has to show up at Andrews Air Force Base at like 6 a.m. on the day that you're flying, and you have to go like at a week at a time. And so on the plane itself, first is the judge and, his staff. They sit at the front of the plane. Then they put the family, if it's for 9/11, for the 9/11 case, they put 10 family members of the victims of 9/11 and their companies. So the government runs a lottery for the family members of victims of 9/11 who want to go to Guantanamo, wants to see it. So then they pick whoever gets to go. Then the prosecutors and their teams, then the defense lawyers and their teams, the paralegals, then the NGO observers, and at the very back are the journalists. Like, so and the reason for that was partially because Carol Rosenberg is such a dogged and phenomenal journalist that she would regard the plane with all these people she'd want to interview as if they were all captive, and she could just move up and down the plane, like working her stories. And so they confine journalists to the back of the plane now. But on the base, it's really varied depending, like it's mostly reservists who are assigned as the public affairs officers, as we would call them, our monitors. So sometimes you get like a delegation of reservists who are really nice and friendly, and other times you get reservists who buy the hype that journalists are the enemy. And so there can be, a lot of hostility to journalists. We're not free to like move about the base. I mean, there are some, you're allowed to walk to the closest beach and things, but everywhere we go on the base, we have to go as groups, like if we're going to dinner, we all have to vote on whether we want to go to the Irish pub or the Mongolian barbecue or whatever. So we move together with our military minders. And so it's, you really don't feel like it's very, I mean, you can't roam around Guantanamo freely, for sure.
Patricia has a question, I believe.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had a chance, for what you say recently, probably not, but did you have the chance to talk individually with each of the prisoners there, or at least with some of them? Can you talk us about some personal stories about these prisoners?
Yeah, well, you can't, I mean, even during when journalists would go do prison tours, you are not allowed to interact with the detainees at all. And in fact, in the one prison I had shown the image in my PowerPoint of the compliant prisoners. I mean, one of the ironies is that the Bush administration decided to disregard the Geneva Conventions, which are the main body of the international humanitarian law, in order to torture these people. But now, after, they lost a couple of court cases, now the reason why we're not allowed to take photos of detainees, even though they can't see us because it's like one-way mirrors in there, is because it violates the Geneva Convention to, take photos of prisoners. But in the old military commission building, which was the old repurposed dental lab or whatever for the base, the courtroom was so small that you were literally within touching distance. So when I went to the Omar Khadr hearings, I could almost reach out and touch him, but any journalist who would even speak to somebody or a detainee could immediately be thrown off the island. So there's a lot of, if any of you are like fans of Michel Foucault, it's a lot of discipline and punish going on there. Everybody has to self-discipline or they lose their privilege to go to Guantanamo.
You have time for one last question. If anyone has one last question, please feel free to ask it.
Well, I just want to say it's really, it's Patricia that I think you're asked, but it's really been nice to see all you guys. And I'm sorry if I set you off on a depressing note, but it is, I think it's an interesting problem. And next time I see some of you in person, we can continue this conversation over some Castelli wine. So I think that's it, everybody. It's really been a pleasure to be able to talk with you. And Ivy and Jabara, thank you so much for organizing it. And Drew, love
Yes,
you.
no, thank you, Lisa. This has been great.
Okay.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Drew. So just before everyone signs off, I just want to say quickly, check the Global Tufts Month website again. And Vicky, if you want to talk about your event really quickly, I know some people already signed off, but Vicky's organizing an event in the next 2 days, actually.
Yeah, like the Central European chapters, London is doing an event like this on biology or bigotry about whether the impact on the minority communities of COVID, the higher impact, is caused by poor social conditions, racism, anything like that, or whether there's actually a biological root to it. And it's being hosted by the Dean of the Graduate School of Biological Sciences, so he's our scientist, and also someone from the medical school's public health policy. So we think that's going to be just as engaging and interesting as this wonderful presentation has been. So
Probably
we hope
less
you can join us.
depressing. So, okay.